Mark, thank you so much for being on the show. Very much appreciated. You are a product marketing expert and host of your own show, and I know your time is super valuable. So I'm excited to jump on and talk to you here today. So thanks again. Why don't we take a quick second to kind of introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get into product marketing?
Yeah, happy to do it. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. Super excited to be here as well. So a bit about me. I've been in product marketing for, it's crazy to say out loud, almost a decade. Generous in the rounding there a bit, but pretty close to it. And how I got into it was probably a story that other product marketers have had to tell themselves, in that I didn't really know what product marketing was at the time. So it's funny, I was doing my MBA and I knew I wanted to get into tech-based marketing of some kind. I wanted to be in marketing. I wanted to work at a tech-based company. So I wasn't too particular or worried or concerned about the role, as long as I was in marketing and in tech. And more specifically at the time, I was really interested in the video game industry. As I'm sure most people my age grew up with video games. It was a time in my life where I felt, you know what, if I'm going to give this whole video game business a go, this is the right time. So I actually ended up having a conversation with an HR director at a local game studio where I live. And during the conversation, things had been going well. And she basically asked me, listen, we've got two open marketing positions. One is in corporate marketing and one is in product marketing. Do you know which between the two you feel you'd be more interested in? And in a moment of, I don't know, panic, serendipity, whatever you want to call it, I blurted out product marketing. And I think subconsciously I had thought, corporate marketing sounds pretty boring. And product marketing, at least I know what product management is. I know what marketing is. So I feel like there's probably some overlap. So that felt like the smarter option in between the two. And funnily enough, it ended up being the very smart decision, because I was hired as a product marketing manager. And then they had hired another individual for the corporate marketing position. And sadly, that position was, I think, made redundant 6 to 8 months later. So had I gone down that path, I'd probably be in a very different place where I am now. So very roundabout way of saying, I didn't really know what product marketing was at the time, but boy, am I glad that I made that decision that day, and I haven't left the role ever since.
I've said it 1,000 times here, and so whoever does listen to every episode here has heard me say this. If it feels like, product marketing, and I'm pretty sure that this is the case. I'd actually love your take on this. That product marketing is probably one of the most entrepreneurial, founder-like roles within an organization. And it's also actually one of the most nuanced, and here's why I say that. Like, as you know, and thank you so much, because you provided some feedback on Asset Mule and what we've been building here. But within certain organizations, now that we've talked to hundreds of product marketers, it's hard to identify what the actual product marketer does at that organization based on the size. Is kind of seems to be a variable, and then the size of the actual PMM team or marketing team. And so in some cases, they're doing like super strategic positioning, messaging, that kind of thing. In others, they're doing like heavy sales enablement, et cetera. So it's kind of interesting, as we're trying to build tools for product marketers. We're like, what functionality we focus on, right? And then on top of that, it feels like they're what they're working on that week could be completely different than the next week. And so, you might build a set of functionality that focuses on, let's just call it sales enablement, but they won't get to that sales enablement jobs to be done, right? Like for a quarter, right? And so it's super interesting. I say that because I used to build tools. I started a couple companies for sales development reps, 10 years ago, whatever. And it was straightforward. Like, you send emails, you book meetings, and you make calls. Like, whether you're one sales development rep or 100, it's going to be the same thing. The only distinction would be maybe like reporting, on top of that, right? Functionality, but it was the straightforward thing. So this seems to be a lot more nuanced. Does that sort of kind of align with what you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been very fortunate, as you said in my intro, being the host of the Product Marketing Life podcast, that I've spoken to close to 100 product marketers now, I think. I might be a generous number, but pretty close to it. And in every conversation, your observation is correct, that how that individual's day-to-day looks and how their own responsibilities are defined within their org varies dramatically depending on a number of factors. Are they a solo PMM? Are they one of a small team, a medium-sized team? Are they one of a very large team? What stage of growth is that company that they find themselves in at? Are they pre-seed? Are they gaining traction? Are they they achieve product market fit? And then what kind of customers are selling into? Like, there's so many different factors at play that dictate what any given product marketer's area of focus is at any given time. And it's funny because even within their product marketing alliance, which I'm an active member of, we have a number of templates and guides, and I find it so funny when you ultimately go and apply those templates, they're very good starting and jumping off points, but they end up morphing and evolving so dramatically depending on how you're trying to apply it and who you are as a product marketer. So you're right. There is a very nuanced element of product marketing. There's obviously some core tenets, right? You mentioned them: sales enablement, go to market, positioning and messaging, competitive intelligence. There's a whole host of things. But how those ultimately get executed day to day can, as I said, vary dramatically.
Yeah. And hence, as a founder, and I wore the hat, several times over the last X years, if you're constantly sort of like what you're doing varies a lot with what, where you're at, kind of the variables you mentioned. So that's why it feels like that's a good analogy to use. And then also like that PMM seems to be this almost like traffic cop in a way, right? I don't know if that's the right title, but that sort of mediator, right? You have to be able to interface with product, leadership, sales, customer success, all these various functions, and be able to set expectations with each individual, right? Within every org, because everyone's gonna push and pull in different ways. I mean, boy, like I think we might have to roll out like a therapy for PMMs or something, right? Because of that dynamic. But we think a lot about the alignment here between particularly sales and product marketing. And so, that's sort of what keeps us up at night every day. If you were to think about some key steps to help product marketers who are sort of like, launching a new product, but how they would support the enablement of sales, right? Because I think that's where we've all been there on both sides, right? Where like PMMs have done all this work, right? They put all these things together, and then somehow sales continues to either not get it or go rogue and all that sort of stuff. And then people are blaming each other, etc. So again, we think a lot about the uniting of these forces, because I think, it's clear that, us united on the same page, we're just much more effective and valuable, right? So any sort of tips, particularly around that product launch piece?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, depending on whether you're fortunate enough to work at an organization where you have a dedicated sales enablement team or resource, or, if you are a PMM interfacing with sales leadership, whether they're AMs, whether they're the VP of sales, I think regardless of who your primary point of contact is, the most important thing that I've seen in terms of enabling sales around a product launch is getting those individuals in the launch process early and often. I think so often, and again, this varies dramatically depending on your organization, but especially if you find yourself at an org where you're constantly releasing, whether it be updates to existing products, full new pieces of functionality, new products in and of themselves, it's easy for you just to focus on what's going live in that given moment or in the next couple of weeks or months. And I think it's important as a product marketer, take a step back and say, hey, well, how early can I bring those customer facing teams, specifically sales and sales enablement, into that process? Maybe there's an opportunity for, during the product development phase or discovery phase to loop those individuals in. And they might not necessarily actively participate in that stage of the development process, but at least make them aware of what's going on, so that 3 weeks, months, a quarter down the line, when that product is ultimately ready to ship, they've been brought along and they've been able to bring at the appropriate time the broader sales team along with them. And, as I know you can appreciate, and you know quite well, sales teams are busy, right? They're not necessarily focusing on what's coming down the product pipeline 3 months from now. They care about what's happening right now. But even if you can just kind of seed the market, if you're using your sales team as a market analogy, it helps them be better prepared for ultimately when that thing does go live to say, hey, I understand it. My manager's been taking me along for the ride. I get why we're doing this, or at least I know why or that it's coming. And I feel more comfortable on launch day. I feel like there's no surprise. That's the big thing, is you don't want to surprise anybody. So that's the first piece. I think the other thing that I've seen really help in this department is just helping them and ensuring that they understand the why behind that product launch, right? I think it's easy, again, to get caught up in this continuous cycle of what's new, what's updated, this is exciting.
What are our competitors doing? Yeah,
exactly. But I think it's important to take a step back and say, hey, why are we doing this? What's the value to the business and what's the value to the customer? And that's typically how myself at Jobber and my fellow go-to-market product marketers approach these launches, is kind of first and foremost, hey, what are we building or what are we launching and why are we doing it? What is the value that we're adding to a business from maybe it's an acquisition perspective, an expansion perspective, a retention play, whatever it might be. And then ultimately, and I would argue as a product marketer, more importantly, is what's the value to the customer? Why are they going to care about this? And if you can't effectively articulate both those things, you're never going to get that kind of shared understanding of why this is important and why someone on the sales team should care. And I think to take that a step further, you also want to make sure that, again, whether it's the sales leaders that you're interfacing with or the sales enablement team, that they can then articulate that effectively to the customer-facing sales reps, right? It's one thing to sit in a presentation and have someone dictate information to you and absorb it. You want to make sure that that individual is comfortable, putting that back out and saying that using the right positioning and messaging or the guidance that you provided so they can effectively go and sell it to the customer. The last two things, super minor. Understanding the priority, I think, is super important as well. As I said, especially if you find yourself at an org where there are a ton of different product releases going out at any given time, understanding where any given product is in terms of its priority relative to other future launches. We talk a lot about in product marketing, a P1 release or a tier 1, depending on how you define your framework, all the way down to a P3 or even a P4, and sharing that framework with sales so that they understand it, they get it, so that they can easily say, hey, this is a P1. I need to pay attention to this. This is a P2. Okay, this is important, not as important as a P1, but still important for me to know. P3, P4, okay, maybe this isn't super critical. It's likely not going to come up in active sales conversations. And then lastly, showing it in action, right? I think there's something to be said for just having your product manager join you on those conversations with sales to just show them what the functionality actually looks like so that they can then conceptualize it, absorb it, and then share it with their potential customers and their opportunities in a real environment, or at least be able to describe what that looks like. I just find that is much more effective than just showing static screenshots or showing designs. The better you can give them a live demo, I think the more effective that ultimately becomes.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. As you were articulating these points, I kept thinking about, boy, where does the pushback or the disconnect happen a lot in my experience? And I spent most of my career on the sales side, and then on the last couple of years formally on the marketing side, which some would argue I was always a marketer, not a real salesperson, which is I've heard that feedback from friends and colleagues. But one thing that I've seen was that, and over is like sales reps, right? Like the sales manager, or let's say VP level sales, stakeholder, whatever, might be on board with and aligned with the PMM and, the leadership on the marketing side and the product side, et cetera, leadership, the C-suite, et cetera. But it's that individual rep who's in the trenches every day seems to constantly be complaining, like, we've been asking for this feature for 1,000 years and it still hasn't come. And that seems to kind of like stir the pot. So, the CEO might think that everything's fine, right? Or that C-level, or even the PMM, because the PMM's sitting there going, hold on a second. Like, I meet with leadership, sales leadership, whatever, a cadence, and everything seems to be fine. But it's that rep. Any sort of advice that you would have for PMMs around that to manage and maybe this is the art of this whole dynamic, to make sure that they are getting involved with that or with that rep level, right? But tactfully doing it so they're not stepping on toes and things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things I'll say in that. The first is, it said earlier about understanding the why. I think taking it the next step further, and when you're in those one-on-one conversations, articulating the why for that individual rep. So, hey, we are launching this specific piece of functionality or this update because it's going to add this value to the customer and to the business, which will ultimately help you close more deals or go after this specific market that we've been targeting and that has identified this as a gap. So trying to tie it to how it's going to impact an individual, I think, goes a long way. But then on the flip side, if I think about your question around how do you manage feedback from sales reps who say, hey, I've been asking for this for months. Our customers have been asking. I've lost deals because of this. I think it's important as a product marketing manager to push for a mechanism to kind of quantify that. I'm glad you asked this question because I myself am actually in the middle of chatting with customers right now, and I'm being bombarded with feedback and opportunities on how the product can be improved upon and gaps that our product might have and where those issues are. So I definitely can empathize with a sales rep who hears that same feedback and feels somewhat powerless to address it from a product perspective. So I think it's important to take that qualitative feedback and then add a quantitative element. And that's some of the pushback that I've received in sharing my own observations and feedback from customers with the broader product leadership and kind of the leadership of the business unit that I support is, hey, this is great. And these conversations and insights you're developing are fantastic. But how do we know that we should be prioritizing this relative to the myriad, 1,000 other things that we could be developing? So I think if, as a PMM, you can take that sales feedback and that customer feedback and partner with your analytics professionals or your product team to quantify that. And that's how you make a more compelling argument for, how you can drive impact and also get it prioritized relative to things that might not necessarily drive as much impact in comparison. So that's what I would say. And it's obviously easier said than done in a lot of situations, but the closer you can get to taking that qualitative and adding a quantitative element, I think the easier that conversation is.
In terms of like key challenges that, and I think we may have covered this already, but if you had to highlight a couple key challenges that PMMs face around product launches, anything that stands out, maybe it's just one or two, and then maybe some tips for those folks to overcome them. And maybe just something to add there too is maybe you should keep an eye out for this coming around the corner.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, because product marketing is obviously so close to product in a lot of orgs, there is this understanding or shared pain of shifting launch dates, right? It's easy for product marketing to take a step back and say, okay, well, product is saying this is the launch date. And then when the date shifts, it's easy to point the fingers and say, oh, product overpromised and underdelivered, or the developers are not working fast enough, or they didn't plan this properly. And I think an effective product marketer will have those feelings and be okay with those feelings, but then realize, hey, this shifting launch dates maybe becomes a pattern. How can I get closer to product so that I understand when that is a possibility and something could get pushed? And then also making sure that the go-to-market teams that I'm partnering with are aware of potential delays as soon as possible. So it should be no surprise that if, as the PMM kind of quarterbacking this launch, I go to the go-to-market team and say, hey, we're actually going to push this out a couple weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It shouldn't come as a shock because ideally, I've been having those conversations with product and the go-to-market team for quite some time. And yeah, obviously it's some surprises are unavoidable. There's only so much you can do, and code is code and it can be challenging at times. So those things you're never gonna be able to account for, but at least having that openness and conversations that, hey, things could shift and this is why, I think goes a long way. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I would say, or the other challenge that I've seen, is this idea of shifting scope. Again, on the product side, once you get into addressing a specific customer problem or pursuing a specific opportunity, on paper during the design and discovery phase, it can seem quite simple. But then ultimately, when you go to hand it off to the devs, it could become, hey, we thought this was going to take 3 months. It's now going to take 6. And I know that ties back to this idea of shifting launch dates. But what I've seen is that sometimes product will then come back and say, hey, we're actually going to cut scope a bit so that we can get this out sooner. And then as the PMM, you have to be able to be nimble and maybe look back at the positioning and messaging that you framed and the why and the justification for going down this path and making changes and then communicating those changes to the go-to-market team so that they are informed as to why all of a sudden we were going from shipping A to now shipping C or D. And it's still fundamentally going to be A at some point, when we ultimately go live, it's going to be a different version of that. And then lastly, I think one of the things that I know I've been pushed to get better at myself more recently is understanding, what do we do after the launch? I think it's obviously very easy, especially as I said, in those environments where you're constantly launching new things, to focus on that launch as a moment in time and okay, on to the next one, on to the next one, on to the next one. And obviously if you're a lone PMM, that is a very easy habit to get into because someone's got to do the go-to-market work and someone's got to prepare for the launch. But I think it's important to, again, work with your product sales, customer-facing go-to-market partners to say, okay, after we've launched, what are we going to do after? What's the measurement plan for us to see whether or not we achieve the metrics? And ideally, you would have defined those metrics prior to the launch, not afterwards. What do we do when we start receiving feedback from customers that, hey, maybe this fell short on expectations, maybe it exceeded expectations, how we can take advantage of that? And then ensuring we're doing that on a predetermined timeline. So I'm not just saying, oh yeah, at some point in the future, we'll take a look back. It's like, no, 3 months out, 6 months out, 12 months out. We're going to take a look at this launch and see how it performed. And then we're going to make a decision as a group. Do we need to reinvest resources back into fixing the problems that come up? Is there an opportunity for us to pursue and capitalize on, again, where we're winning based on customer feedback? So having that, set cadence of taking a look back, I think is important.
Awesome. Speaking of taking a look back, and I super appreciate your time here. Just kind of one last question that came to mind is, when you look at positioning and messaging, how do you sort of assess sort of the the performance of that? And I know there might be some tools out there. Maybe there's some other methods of actually assessing that, but any sort of best practices that you've seen work well?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think in the context of the launch, this is where we started this conversation. I typically look at it through the lens of, pre-launch, can we engage with customers to show them what the potential product is going to look like and get some feedback on what we think the positioning and messaging or what the value is based on the discovery work that we've done, and then getting some feedback. And you can do those through customer interviews, showing them different positioning concepts and getting feedback on those. If you've got something that you can point to on maybe a website that's hidden from the general public, you can use a tool like Winter to get messaging and positioning feedback from prospective customers. So those are some tools that you can do, or some methods you can use, I should say. Then I think, as I just alluded to earlier, this idea of post-launch. Okay, it's in market. Did the positioning and messaging that we launched with resonate? Are we seeing strong adoption, strong engagement? Are we falling short? Is positioning and messaging contributing to that? Are we saying one thing, but customers, once they get in the product and they engage it, are seeing a disconnect between what we think the value is and what they're actually getting out of the product, and what changes do we need to make? And then anytime there's a major update to the product. So again, this idea of taking a look back and being reflective and, hey, we launched with this positioning and messaging, the product has now evolved and become something slightly different. Do we need to make an adjustment? The other kind of moments in time, I would say it's important as a PMM to start exploring whether or not a positioning and messaging change is needed, is any major shifts in the market, right? Whether that's macro at the economic level, whether that's just customer behavior changing. Anytime that there's a major shift in the market, you want to reevaluate. So again, I think the one that people are probably most familiar with, and maybe even sick of hearing at this point, is this emergence of AI. Or re-emergence, I should say. It's been around for a lot longer than I think most people think, right? But there's a lot of companies out there where they saw this shift in the market and this emphasis on AI, and it's like, okay, well, how can we incorporate the power of AI in our own positioning and messaging, and how do we have to reflect that back to our customers into the market? The last two, competitive activity as well. Sometimes a new market entrant or an existing competitor can update their own positioning and messaging around just themselves as an organization or a specific product. And as a product marketer, you have to be aware of that and understand, hey, do we have to react to that? Are they now positioning their solution in a way that's changing how the whole category is perceived? And do we need to react to that and make sure that we are aligned with that new category perception? And then lastly, I think it's just important to just have like a regular cadence, right? It doesn't have to be along any of those specific, just three other kind of dimensions I mentioned. It could be just an annual review, semi-annual. I think it's just important, again, on this idea of looking back, as I've said a couple of times, just have those moments and times where you take a couple of weeks and you say, hey, we're going to look at our existing positioning and messaging. We're going to send some customer surveys. We're going to have conversations with customers and just see like, hey, are we still on is this positioning and messaging still resonating with our customers? And yeah, I would say any kind of schedule you can get in, or a habit of doing that, the more effective and more powerful your positioning and messaging will ultimately become.
Awesome, Mark. Thank you so much. It's so clear when every time I talk to you that you've been down this road plenty of times and have a lot of wisdom to share. If folks wanted to follow you on social, connect with you, maybe listen to your show, what are some good URLs or handles to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody ever wants to get in touch with me, obviously LinkedIn I think is probably the easiest. You can get my name from the show notes and the spelling. Alternatively, in the Product Marketing Alliance, in our Slack community, if you want to chat with me there, I check that quite frequently as well. And then if you like what I had to say and you want to hear me chat with other bright minds, specifically product marketers, about anything and everything related to product marketing, I am the host of the Product Marketing Life podcast, which is again put together by the Product Marketing Alliance, which you can find on any major podcast app. So yeah, that's probably the best place to find me.
Awesome, Mark. Have a great day, and thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on. This has been great.